Okay, thank you, Steve. Thanks for joining us today. The last time we spoke was January or February. It was a really difficult time for the country at that point. We were in the midst of a bushfire crisis, and you and your organisation had your hands full dealing with that. It's now with COVID-19, it's been an interesting start to 2020, to say the least. How's that affected you and the business?
Well, it's remarkable how things change, I suppose. The country was very focused on the bushfires around Christmas time or so, January, and we were also. We were in two regions where bushfires were dominating, and one was the New South Wales mid-north coast, where we didn't actually lose a property, and we managed to assist clients on the way through, keep services open. None of our staff were affected other than through transport links. Mm-hmm. In East Gippsland, where we are the emergency housing provider there as well, we had prepared a number of properties in the event that we would need them, and we had the availability of funding to meet emergency accommodation across the region. As it happens, we have one emergency house in Malakuta with 2 tenancies, and that was one of the only houses in that particular street that didn't burn down, interestingly enough. And one of the tenants at the beginning of the bushfire season decided to move off to Geelong and stayed there, and the other stayed in Malakuta. With bushfires, generally the impacts on housing tend to appear later, and as people make decisions about whether to stay in the region, whether it's sustainable, whether it's viable for their life, and there's usually long-term effects of bushfires, and we will see those as they come through. We assisted a number of households, and we expect to continue to do that as time goes on. Of course, this is entirely different with a pandemic affecting the whole world and changing working habits everywhere. And so the whole organisation has prepared itself for a move to work from home. That involved around about 420 staff or so. Of course, our construction and maintenance staff didn't need to do that, and we've had to have social distancing protocols, but the remaining staff all transitioned through to work from home, and we keep 6 offices open which provide services to the homeless in different regions. And we essentially have an intercom service, and just for those people who rock up to our doorstep, they may have lost their phone, or the phone fell out of charge. They needed emergency assistance and could only come to the office. And then they would be directed through to an office if necessary, and an interview would happen in the office, shall we say, or in home. They're triaged through, depending on what is needed at the time, and then they're allocated accommodation. So that's what's happened to ourselves. It's been, I'm sure every other organisation in Australia is similarly affected.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's unprecedented what we're dealing with. But as we know, the human species is amazing. We can get through some pretty challenging times and come out the other side of it. So we look forward to when that day arrives. I just wonder if we could change tack a little bit, and let's talk about your history, Steve. I'm not sure if everyone in the sector knows about your interesting background, but you started Community Housing Limited in the early 90s, a $63,000 grant, if I'm right.
Yep.
Back
That's
then.
Right.
And now, as you just said, you employ over 400 people globally. You've got operations in Australia, Chile, India, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Peru, Rwanda, etc. Your business is generating in excess of $40 million worth of turnover. you would have to say that this has been a success story that we like hearing here in Australia. Do you reflect much on where you've come and what you've achieved?
Probably not on where I've come from and what's been achieved. I'm always aware of the need which is not met. And in Australia, really, there's about 500,000 people who need social and affordable housing, which do not have their needs met. At the moment, we're probably only about 4% of stock in Australia, and really we need to find a way to get up to 10%. And in many parts of the world where we work, the journey is only just starting.
Right.
So I am always beset by the scale of the need that's in front of us, and really that's what I have my eyes fixed on all the time. So the organization is always trying to ramp up its capacity to meet need, advocate for more funding, advocate for more ways to get more housing so that we can resolve the needs of the most vulnerable in our society. So, one can look back, but I'm not really one who does that much, in fact.
Yeah, and Steve, that jump from 4% of stock to 10% of stock, there's no such thing as a silver bullet. But what's the fundamentals that need to be put in play here, especially here in Australia, to meet that gap?
Well, I think really a greater focus by government on this policy area is pretty important. They've started to make moves. The introduction of the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation is a pretty valuable tool and vehicle, and further investment in that particular vehicle would be welcome. And then we are able to engage with developers and to have a takeout in terms of most developments that would occur in Australia. Certainly a standardization of inclusionary zoning in every part of the country, so that every development above a certain size would have a natural part which is affordable housing. And then we are starting to have a framework by which we can develop and create that proportion of housing being affordable housing. And I think that's necessary for any sophisticated and advanced economy to have, so that we can have people who may fall between the cracks, may not have the best of incomes or so, to be supported to be able to work in any of the locations where services are required.
Yeah, and Steve, is there appetite from government, financiers, developers, and the like to meet that 6% gap? Are they appreciative of what's needed?
I think everybody is beginning to come to the table. I think there would always need to be subsidy for the social housing component, those people
right.
who will have to depend on benefits for their income. And so there'll need to be some additional subsidy for that. But the backing of state governments' broad-based inclusionary zoning policies, which haven't come to pass everywhere as yet, and also continued and increasing support for NFIC would actually allow affordable housing to be generated through the community housing sector. And the community housing sector needs to rise to meet that challenge, and I'm sure it will over the next decade.
Yeah, okay. Now, Steve, I've been interested in reading about your history and your life in the UK specifically, and I'm aware that you've spent something in the order of 10 to 15 years either living rough or living on the streets in the UK. That must have been a remarkable experience for you in your own development personally and perhaps professionally?
Yes, well, it certainly clarified for me why sort of secure housing is so important to people. It was only in the last probably 5 to 10 years of that experience where I realized, it dawned on me, the deficits in my own life which were sort of created by that. If you don't know where you're going to live from month to month, then there's no way you can really plan to undertake study, to get the qualifications necessary for your career, to plan career development. It's just something a lot of people probably take for granted. And when you have that experience, you're just living month to month when you're in squatting or short life accommodation, as we called it back then. And of course, if you're sleeping rough, you only can plan for the next day at the very best. And it's a very, if you're living from day to day, and a lot of people in the world do live from day to day, then it's very difficult to plan for your future. And that is really the kind of lessons I had, rather than the actual experiences in their own right. Those lessons are the ones which really came out from that long and lengthy period.
And did you feel that you as a person, or maybe your character, how your character was shaped through that experience, or were you the same person going into that experience as you were coming out the end of it?
Well, I suppose I was a fairly, shall we say, loose and adventurous guy when I went into that period, and nothing fazed me very much. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to go and, sleep rough and scavenge for food in the way I did at some of those times or so. As it went on, I had a family and with my partner, and it became much more apparent to me that it was not a great beginning to life for my children to live in such insecure circumstances, and that's what ultimately drove me to plan to move to Australia, where things became a lot securer.
Yeah. No, it's a good story, Steve. It's so interesting. And you embarked on some political activism or a political career as such?
Yes, in the mid-80s, I made the foolish decision that rather than just being an activist on the street or so, from house to house and assisting people, that I really wasn't making much headway, which was true. That I would enter politics and join a political party and be elected to office, and with the principal goal to advocate for for better response to homelessness and better response to housing. I did achieve that. Was elected. I became the head of the housing authority in the London Borough of Camden, and was beset with the huge problem of dealing with the flows of homeless coming into the borough. And we didn't manage to do a whole lot at that time, because our capacity to expand housing was dependent on national government controls over the amount we borrowed, and they didn't want us to borrow any more to expand the amount of housing available. And so we just had to put people up in temporary emergency accommodation, and it was quite disappointing professionally as well from my side. So it wasn't the greatest experience, I have to say. One of the few advantages I had was I managed to lead a campaign for single people who are homeless, who were being denied, prospectively denied benefits through changes in national government legislation. And by running a campaign against that, which involved employing pro bono lots of Queen's councils to prepare cases in the courts to shoot down the legislation, I and my friends, if you like, were one of the only groups of people which managed to knock out pieces of legislation twice, which went through Parliament, which didn't endear me to the Margaret Thatcher regime at the time.
Right, and a quick flight out to Australia, I'm sure, ensued from there. Just for scale, Steve, you said the borough had a significant homelessness challenge to solve. Can you give us a bit of a sense on scale?
Scale of the London Borough of Camden?
Yeah, well, and the homelessness challenge you're trying to resolve?
Well, we had about, I mean, it's a responsibility of councils in Britain to provide shelter to the homeless. It's a good idea, but it was beginning to take up 10% of the budget of the council alone. And we had 2,000 to 3,000 households and families in temporary accommodation. And we just didn't have the vacancies in our public housing stock, which was nearly 38,000 homes, to be able to manage that kind of inflow occurring. And so essentially more and more families were being put up in pretty poor hotel accommodation, if I'm honest.
Yeah, yeah. And when you emigrated out to Australia, what was your initial thoughts of the Australian context? I assume it was Melbourne you arrived to?
Yes, well, the first thing I did was to examine what the policies and the frameworks of government were compared to the UK, especially in terms of housing policy. And of course, at that time in the 80s, there was a massive boom in the development of public housing by the state government at the time, which was quite gratifying. And it encouraged me to apply for a job for the state government. And there was also a massive boom in the growth, the potential of cooperative housing. So I was in the advantaged position of being the placing the coordinator of housing cooperative programs for the Victorian government, something which I relished, I have to say.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, going to CHL and the journey that you've been on, and your work in the sector more broadly, Steve. One thing that I've noticed coming into the sector is it's not a destination that uni students and maybe others who are looking for a shift in careers might be looking at. Why do you think that is? And for people who are thinking about making the jump, what do you think the advantages are to them personally and professionally?
Well, of course, one of the chief advantages is that one is employing people who want to work in an organisation that assists housing for the poor and lower income people. So we have, like most community housing organisations, we have very high staff support for the mission of the organisation. This would be 85% plus, and we're not unlike many other community housing providers in that. And many private sector companies would really love to have such results in terms of staff support. I mean, most banks would be struggling to get in excess of 50% of their staff to support the mission of those institutions. So we're doing very well in regard to that. So we have a highly committed workforce. People come to work for the organisation because of what it does. And then after that, an organisation like CHL perhaps is a little bit different to some of the community housing providers because of the breadth of its capability and the size of its workforce. So many career opportunities emerge within the organisation, and the organisation supports professional development and and also tries to promote people and staff who show promise within the organisation. So our staff have the opportunity to be able to move interstate. They have the opportunity to be able to move within the organisation to different roles if they show aptitude and a desire. And that's something which I think is very beneficial. The other side is the organisation has a huge number of different types of roles and requires a vast array of skills. And so there's many opportunities for people with different qualifications and backgrounds.
Yeah. And do you find that the nature of the work, the human impact that your work has on people is a real driving force for the people that come and work for CHL and the broader sector?
I think so. There's a tremendous sense of satisfaction by staff at the operational levels who deal directly with clients when they manage to resolve somebody's position of homelessness or high housing need, and they can directly see the results of their work appearing on the ground. That's something that is more in my imagination from where I sit, which is it's only when I actually go and open a project and meet the tenants or the residents or so that I'm able to actually see the results, whereas people at the operational levels can see the results of their work day by day.
Yeah.
And they know how it affects people on the ground.
Yeah, and bringing it back to your history and your life story about living in really challenging environments, does that also give you a greater sense of focus on your vision and mission of providing solutions, because you know where people are coming from who utilise your services? Sure.
Well, I'm solely occupied on the exercise of how to generate housing at a lower cost to people who are in high need, and also that it's modified to meet their needs should they have disabilities, and that it's well located for securing employment. That's my sole focus. The more housing to be generated for people at a cost that they can afford, that is my entire sort of working goal. And whenever we're generating developing projects, the first point of assessment is how does it meet people's needs at the bottom of society, and that's really the lower income areas, and that's really what we're focused on. That's our starting point. It doesn't matter which country we're working in. Yeah, excellent. And do you provide opportunities for your staff or help educate them and understand? Because many of your staff probably haven't slept rough or had the need to sleep rough or live on the streets, etc. Do you help them understand the circumstances some of your clients are exposed to? I think the staff, after working in the organisation, are exposed to the circumstances of people through the people who come to the office, and some of the staff may have had some difficult experiences with housing as well. Quite a lot of staff through the ages have actually come to the organisation after surprisingly being caught in a position where they're vulnerable in terms of their own housing, and that has opened their eyes to the circumstances of people. And also we have thankfully had quite a lot of our tenants and those who come to us who've been prepared to be interviewed, and also we've been able to, bring that to the attention of our staff, and that has made them a lot more aware of just how people have lived. I certainly feel very similar to a lot of the people who are on the videos on our websites or so, which have described their lives while they were homeless. Yeah. No, it's an amazing thing that you're able to deliver your services with that sense of compassion. It's obviously got to be critical to what you do from a day-to-day perspective. It's very important. I think right now, for example, in the current pandemic, we are expanding our level of contact to the people who receive our services, and all of it's about seeing how people are travelling and getting in touch with them more often than we otherwise would do, because we usually try to respect people's privacy a bit, but at the moment we're upping our contact rates because we just want to be sure that people are travelling okay. Yeah, and just on COVID-19, Steve, what are you expecting the business climate to look like at the end of this? Hopefully, the end of this process, which is hopefully soon. But what are you expecting
the business landscape to look like?
Well, there's some hopes and there's some expectations. I think one of the first expectations is that there's going to be a harsh wake-up call for everyone in terms of the debt that's been taken on by the government in terms of the additional assistance it's providing at the moment, and that is going to introduce possibly higher interest rates. That's going to introduce higher taxation choices about who to impose those taxes on. And I think that's going to create more difficult business conditions. On the other side, I would hope that there is a recognition by government that in this present environment, that's one of the first requisites of resolving the pandemic is working from home, living at home, isolating at home. A home is more important than it's ever been before. And if you don't have a home, then how can you self-isolate? How can you work from home? How can you keep the community free from infection? And how can you keep yourself free from infection? So this is one of the key and most important aspects of recognition I'm hoping is going to occur at a government level. I say that with some trepidation because while the government has very necessarily and very well introduced payments for people who are out of work and payments for people to stay in work, they haven't resolved or introduced anything in relationship to rent assistance, which affects, a third of the population. And there is a bit of a free-for-all going on at the moment in the rental market, and that doesn't really cover the government with glory at present. So if I look at what's going to happen afterwards, the government hasn't really placed housing policy at the height of its agenda. We would all like it to, but it doesn't have the record to date.
Yeah, so it's going to take a big shift in focus, you think?
Yes.
Steve, probably the last question for you today is, I've read that you believe that the only way to deliver houses to the masses is through a business-focused but idealistically driven business model. Could you just expand on that for our listeners?
Well, CHL is a social enterprise, and therefore what we generate in surpluses, which isn't that much, also is redirected into our mission to provide more housing or to reduce the cost of housing. However, in terms of having a business focus, the reason why it would be a business focus is in order to resolve the needs of people at the lower end, it needs to be a replicable model. Simply requiring governments to pour subsidies into housing is not going to be achievable. Simply expecting philanthropy to do the same is also not going to be achievable to resolve the problem at scale. And so in order to resolve the problem at scale, the overall system needs to be set up to encourage replicable models, and therefore it needs to operate within the market in a framework where affordable housing is built into the market in a way that everybody accepts. And that's what is necessary, and that's what CHL as an organisation is advocating for at every turn. And those countries that manage to do that will be the countries that resolve the housing and the affordable housing needs of their populations. There are some countries that do a very good job. It's built into the environment as a whole. Yeah. Germany, for example, Austria, for example. Those countries do know how to manage their housing systems to meet the needs of all, and that has to happen everywhere.
Yeah, and just lastly, Steve, in regards to skill sets within your organisation, what are the skills that you think you'll be looking for into the future? Are they different to what they are now, or is there more of the same?
In terms of the future, as the organisation ramps up to expand its development capacity, we will be increasingly needing more architectural, more financial modeling, more treasury management, more project management skills within the organization. We have fully developed skills and capacity around the housing management. In the last decade, we moved pretty much from a housing development company to being a housing management company. I expect us to move back to a greater amounts of proportion of our activities being in housing development, with all the requirements attached to that, and as well as continuing on our increasing and improving capacity at housing management.
Yeah, and lastly, Steve, you're working on Easter Saturday, obviously talking to me, which I'm very grateful for. What's the rest of the Easter break got planned for you? And lastly, I want to know, since you've been in self-isolation, has there been any old skills that you've, or some old habits that you've drawn on, maybe watching an old movie that you haven't had the chance to watch for a while, or picking up a paintbrush, for instance? Is there any old hobbies that you've entertained?
Well, I'm in a curious situation where I was caught overseas, and for various reasons, it became not very attractive to return.
Right.
And one of those was that I live in a fairly remote setting in Australia, where the panic buying in the public stripped all the shelves, and it continues to strip all the shelves. Right. So the opportunity of coming back for 2 weeks of self-isolation in a place where panic buying was had been really sort of removed all the food, or so, wasn't very attractive. And then after that, the number of flights sort of disappeared, and so I'm stuck here until travel and movement changes, and I'm really not sure when that's going to occur.
Yeah.
So, but the other side of it hasn't really changed my life at all, because the organisation has around about 30 offices or so, and I always tell my staff I won't be in 29 of them at any one time.
No, there you go.
And I've largely worked online and worked from, not home, but worked from remote settings wherever I am, which is, that's my standard way of working. What is not standard is that I'm now in one place. I have tended to move around at breakneck speed in the last 10 years, taking 10 to 16 flights a month, and now I'm taking none.
Yeah.
So that's one of the big changes, and now I'm relearning the art of staying in one place and of stability of location.
Yeah, and
so that's one of the changes.
Yeah, is it hard for you to get out of that mode of being busy and moving? Has that been challenging?
That's been interesting. Yes, I haven't felt it as much as I thought I would feel it, but it is actually, it's quite welcome to be in one place, which has been, I've only actually stayed for 1 month in one place. This is the third time in 10 years, in a decade. So for me to be 1 month in one place, which I've been so far, is a very unusual experience for me, and welcome.
And who would have thought that having excess toilet paper is now a luxury item in a lot of people's lives? So
that's right. Yes.
Things have changed. Things have changed immensely. Well, Steve, I'm going to let you go, because you've been very generous in your time today, and I want to thank you for being part of our Industry Connect interviews that we'll be doing very regularly over the next month or two. So I want to thank you for your time today and your support of the work that we do at AHI. So thanks so much for that.
And thank you for giving up your time on a Easter Saturday as well. And I wish you and your family well for the remainder of the Easter break.
Thank you, Steve, and yours as well. You take care of yourself.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.